Hello. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this talk corner that is hosted by Agra's VALUE4HER. And thank you so much for joining us on this very, very important day. It is the Gender Day at COP26, and we did not want to lose this momentum to discuss the gender issues in climate change for Africa. So that is what the discussion today is about. Of course, we know that climate change has a greater impact on those who are mostly relying on nature, but also those that have limited capacity to cope with the hazards that do come with the changes that we are seeing. And women fall within this category. And that is why this conversation is very, very important today. We know that they have been victims, but we also know that they can be game changers. And this is a conversation today. So Talk Corner is a special segment of VALUE4HER. VALUE4HER is Agra's continental initiative around women agripreneurship in agriculture. We know that women are mostly engaging on the production end of agriculture. We would like them to also benefit from the business end of agriculture. So that is what the VALUE4HER initiative is about. Today we have a lineup of very, very special women. And I start off with the introduction of the moderator, a remarkable lady who is steering a huge portfolio at Agra. She is called Aggie Conde. She's the Vice President for Program Innovation and Delivery. And within her portfolio also sits the climate change and resilience agenda for agriculture that Agra pursues. So she is going to be the moderator. And at this moment, I will hand over to her to take us through the rules of engagement for this dialogue and also to bring her panel on board. Thank you so much. Welcome again. And do feel free to share your concerns, your questions, your insights, your remarks on the chat. And I'm sure Aggie will say more about that. Thank you, and over to you, Aggie.
Thank you very much, Sabdio. Thank you so much for introducing me, but most importantly, thanks to the two panelists that we have today for taking their time in a very busy schedule to have a conversation with us about what it means today on day 9 of COP26 for the intersection between gender, science, and innovation. As you all know, we are grappling in a world of a lot of uncertainties, a lot of volatility, and we are seeing more than ever before two separates, yeah? So on one side, I've been hearing it's a vicious cycle, it's a threat, it's chaotic, it's now or never, it's too little, far too late. And on the other side, I've been hearing it's a collective effort. We can do it. We need to be more efficient. We need to be more inclusive. We need to eat more healthy. So are we indeed living in a world of perils? I think that's the conversation we're going to have with our panel. And to introduce our panel today, I would like to start with one of the panel members who, first and foremost, I would say, she on her Twitter profile, she calls herself a stubborn optimist. She also is a scientist, a mother-in-chief. Those particular titles intrigued me. But more importantly, she is a specialist in sustainable development, nature-based solutions in climate change, specifically in adaptation, ecosystem-based approaches to mitigation. She also is the former chair of the Global Partnership on Forest and Landscape Restoration, and currently is the vice chair of the Collaborative Partnerships on Forests. Please join me in welcoming to this session, Dr. Musonda Mumba. Welcome, Dr. Musonda. She's currently director for the Rome Center for Sustainable Development, but she will be opening up the session for us. And I will be introducing the second speaker later. But before that, I just had a quick question for you, Dr. Musonda. You were there at COP25. You are there at COP26. What has the time between 25 and 26 created for the planet, people, and businesses? Over to you.
Thank you so very much, Aggie. I must say I'm not at COP26. I'm not in Glasgow, actually. I took a personal decision because of the vaccine inequity towards Africa not to go, but I'm actually participating virtually and also moderating a lot of high-level events at COP, but really from the comfort of my home in a hybrid format. So COP25 was fascinating and it was really interesting. It was a COP led by Chile and the theme was time for action. And if people who remember that round logo and a sort of a sticky arrow in there, it was the last COP that we actually met in person. And there was a lot of rhetoric, a lot of pledges, a lot of commitments. December 2019, 3 months into, in fact, less than 3 months into 2020, all hell broke loose. The very things that we've spoken about as environmentalists, that levels of degradation and our disconnected relationship to nature, there'll be a price to pay. And what we thought was a far-flung idea with movies like, movies like Contagion, seemingly very far, we found ourselves as a planet in the middle of a planetary emergency, a pandemic. So when this happened, it really threw a lot of things off course. Even when we were anticipating, I think initially the world did not think it was too serious. And they're saying, in December, we're going to have the COP, and now it was the UK and Italy co-presidency. And so back to your question, in terms of what was agreed and what we really anticipated from COP25 was that the action moment, and since the Paris Agreement was now coming into effect, we were now going to begin really the real work and also investments that were committed towards countries that obviously were reeling, particularly the African continent, suffering sub-Saharan Africa. And we saw how when the pandemic hit, already just this region, Lake Victoria was already flooding. So we saw the intersection of climate change and a pandemic, and you're telling people to social distance when they've just been displaced. So there was that level of complexity. It threw a lot of things out of balance and out of turmoil. And so I'd be happy to also speak to now what the reflection has been over 2021, because obviously the COP itself, COP26, was delayed by a whole year. Over.
So I guess we've got lots to learn from the from the pandemic to the climate change crisis. And I would like to thank you. I'll pause a bit there for a bit and then introduce our second panel. But as I do that, allow me to welcome all our members that are online. I'm seeing participation already from Ethiopia, Egypt, Tanzania, Nigeria, Zambia, Kenya, Uganda. So literally we've got an African representation at the moment, and we'll keep recognizing you. So please keep introducing yourselves in the chat and feel free to share with us your questions in the Q&A box. There's two different places, Q&A box for the questions, introductions in your chat. So as COVID was happening, there was another young lady busy creating businesses. Yeah, so I want to hear the opportunities here. So I will introduce our second panel member. She completed her PhD in food science, researching insects as an alternative to meat. Between this panelists, you need to know I am vegan, so I'm probably your customer number one. But she also in 2016 co-founded Gourmet Grub, which focused on creating proteins from farmed insects. And these were lactose and gluten-free. In 2018, she was a finalist in the Go-Getters competition, again for our insect milk innovation. And in 2021, while COVID was happening and we were all locked up in the houses, this entrepreneur co-founded De Nova Dairy using precision fermentation to produce animal-free dairy proteins. Now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Leah Besser, co-founder and CSO of De Nova Dairy. Welcome, Dr. Leah.
Awesome, thanks for having me.
Thank you. And I did not forget, I specifically left this out for later, that you are also a UN climate champion on regenerative agriculture, and you're currently at COP26. So, as the name of your company suggests, De Nova, which I'm meant to understand is a Latin expression for beginning, correct? Yes. And you're the first African company to use fermentation to produce precision animal-free dairy. How within this pandemic did you get to identifying this solution and creating an innovative business that you took out within this pandemic? Please share with us, Dr. Leah.
Yeah, sure. I think during the pandemic, it became abundantly clear just how harsh climate change was and how quickly climate change was happening, especially when people started seeing some of the beautiful things re-emerging from us not interfering. And so it became abundantly clear. And as a result, there was actually this amazing situation where people started putting a lot of investment into climate smart companies just as a whole. But specifically in agriculture, there was just, over COVID, there was just this influx of funding going to startups in climate smart agriculture. So, I mean, the opportunity was definitely there. And as we're starting to go through it, we're starting to notice that livestock is very, very, very harmful to the planet. And crop agriculture is not necessarily better. And it's trying to find alternatives to stop using all this arable land that is actually supposed to be dedicated to nature. I mean, one of the biggest COP26 mandates is really to start looking at reforestation. And then that's essentially going to take away a lot of agricultural land, which took away the forests in the first place. And so where are we going to farm and how are we going to do that? And in a lot of urban areas where it's not arable land, you have the opportunity to look at these sort of innovations to, if you want to call it urban farming or novel farming, where you don't need arable land and you don't need livestock and you don't need crop agriculture. So that's sort of the opportunity that presented itself during COVID. And then, yeah, we just took it. Yeah, we managed to raise some international funding. Also, what's amazing is there's a lot of funding coming into Africa as people are starting to realize that there are a lot of innovations in Africa. I mean, Africans are just the most innovative people you can come across. And I think it's starting to become abundantly apparent. And then on top of that, I mean, we're just going to be the next biggest emerging market, with protein becoming one of the biggest demands as well. So, you know, there's a huge gap in demand for protein and a huge gap in how to fulfill it. So I think it became a very prominent feature during COVID, and people started to realize it. And yeah, where money goes, companies just start flourishing.
I like the way you've brought in where money goes, business flourish, and the ability for you to identify the opportunity within a pandemic. So let me come back to you, Dr. Msonda, on whether the commitments that you're now seeing virtually in COP26 are noise or real, or is it still the usual rhetoric? What would you want to see done differently this year going forward to make sure that we indeed save the planet and leave for our children a planet that they would be able to feel proud about? What should change?
Thank you so much for that question, Aggie. I really like the point that Leah actually talked about in relation to we are the largest emerging market, but also looking at the restoration agenda in terms of the spaces that have not been treated well, or also conserving those spaces that are important. So back to your question, what we've seen over the year is that there's been a delay. So with this complexity of dealing with the pandemic, countries going into crisis, and also economy is going into crisis, as it were, there was a lapse. There was a lapse with governments, you know, those governments that had pledged, particularly the Annex 1 countries that had pledged that they were going to give resources, there was a massive lapse. And this lapse has been called out thanks to a lot of youth voices that are present at COP26, and young people who are young women and men who are just so fearless and very bold and calling out this failure of commitment. But also what we're beginning to see, I mean, in the first 2-3 days of the COP, we saw, you know, Earth Bezos fund basically, we're going to, you know, put 1.7 billion in the Sahel. The forest agriculture trade agreement dialogue from the UK for looking at the Congo Basin and forest restoration investments, etc. Great, you're talking about the money, but can you tell us how we're going to actually do this? And I think this is the important thing. So there'll be an element of accountability, and also there'll be a follow through. I think what's happening now with the power and also the Internet of Things, and particularly the democratization of the internet, we can now follow really the trail and say, if you made a commitment in Glasgow on this, Bezos, great, let's just see where the numbers are rolling and how the actual implementation is going. And so for me, this is really going to be a call to action. And we're really looking forward that this narrative of just, words that, as both Vanessa Nakate from Uganda and Greta Thunberg basically said, the blah, 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 it has to stop. We cannot have the blah, blah, blah. It's like, what does it even mean for lives that are already suffering? We have seen what has happened with the locust infestation here in East Africa. We've seen the floods. We've seen the prolonged droughts. Madagascar is in a crisis. The Sahel is in a crisis, but also there are opportunities where people are really trying to do something, and particularly women and youth are trying to do something, and they need to be supported. Over.
Awesome. So the time of the blah, blah, blah is done. We've got technology to track all these investments. It's now or never. I like the optimism that you bring to this conversation. And indeed, we should be able to follow the blah, blah, blahs and ensure that we hold people accountable. So back to you, Dr. Leah. As a youth, a female, you are at Glasgow, and as Dr. Musonda has mentioned, your voices have been heard loud and clear, and you've caused action. What plans do the youth have to move from the commitments to real action? Because I don't think your role will only stop at getting the commitment said. What plans do you have as young people to make sure that the movement moves beyond commitment to real action that actually solves for our planet?
Yeah, I mean, that's an awesome question. I think it's the action part that's really important. And I mean, there were so many youth protests in the street and really demanding action. And I think it becomes quite exciting when you walk around the COP venue, there's a lot of youth as well, and they're represented in all elements of the sectors. And I think it's really great, for example, with the UN Climate Champions, that they have a youth fellowship, because they're really trying to bring in that diversity of voices, and that sort of, in essence, assists with making the decisions. And I think it's important to have that. And I think a lot of organizations are starting to bring that into their divisions. I mean, our youth fellowship is very much sector-led. So, for example, we have a farmer, I'm a scientist, we have an engineer, we have a lawyer, we have an environmentalist. So it's very much sector specific as well. So it's really informing in those specific silos, which is really important. And I think, aside from just demanding action, I think what we're really looking for is transparency and monitoring as well. As these pledges are being made, it says, how are we tracking it, and how are you disclosing it, and are you being transparent about how it's being done? And I think, as much as we're demanding action, I think the youth is just going to be as vocal about demanding that transparency throughout the process, because we have the technologies now to track it, so there's no excuse. You can't hide anymore. And I mean, as you can hear, the youth are not being quiet about it, and those demands are just going to keep coming, and it's going to be from action to transparency to completing the action and just improving along the way. So I think the youth have definitely had quite a big impact, especially in this COP, and in just sort of, changing the blah, blah, blah to action, which has been very exciting. I think it makes some people nervous.
Yeah, I think we have to get out of our comfort zones. I agree. So I think, thank you very much for that comment. And I think I do subscribe to it. And the question is, how do we all start to participate? So it says that no one is safe until we are all safe. And Dr. Musonda, today is day 9, and the focus is gender, science, and innovation. What does this mean for women in this conversation? We've seen the youth challenging the women and raising their voices, and their voices are being heard. What does this really mean for women? What should change?
Thank you so much for that question, Aggie. I mean, you know what? In 2019, when we launched, when I was still at UNEP, and we launched the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration on the 1st of March 2019, on the 8th of March, the International Women's Day, we also launched a network that I founded called the Network of African Women Environmentalists, really sort of back-to-back and supporting the restoration agenda. What was my interest in making sure that this network actually comes alive? First of all, we have to remember the vision and spirit of the late Professor Wangari Maathai. I mean, she really championed why our ecosystems were important, why our traditional systems and agroecology was important, and why we needed to actually have the faces of these women. I was actually, as a UN diplomat, I was tired of listening to speeches say, 60% of women grow food. Who are these women? Where are they? What do their faces look like? I was baffled. And so one of the things that we've done going forward, and in fact, just 30 minutes ago, we had a side event in Glasgow in COP as part of the NAWE group and NAWE 4-point agenda together with the UK government and other partners, and together with the CTCN, the Climate Technology Center and Network there. And we're proposing 4 things. We're proposing really 4 things around what we're calling the 4-point agenda, looking at the element of data. How do we activate the data revolution for ecosystems? And particularly around ecosystems restoration. There's a lot of information that's being generated by women and youth across the African continent. However, sometimes depending on the dynamics of tenure, etc., this data, the women are not counted. So if you don't count something, then you actually don't invest in that something. So it's important that we make sure that we highlight how women live, how they work sustainably across different landscapes across the African continent. The second point about this agenda is accelerating the uptake of technology and innovation within the agriculture, climate smart agriculture. What are these? And these technologies need to be just technologies, because some technologies are problematic, and we need to make sure that they're right and timely, but also very much inclusive. The third point is accelerating the financial inclusivity around agricultural value chains. A lot of times you walk into a bank and all you see are just some pink balloons in some corner. Here's a package for women, blah, blah. If you have a company, women don't necessarily have companies, but they have, like here in Kenya, they have chamas or they have cooperatives. Can those be recognized so that these financial inclusive mechanisms are meaningful for them? And these enabling policies are very critical, which is what us as UNDP do at the country level with the government within our offices, and making sure that this inclusivity works. And lastly, but not the least, is aggregating the human capital for green jobs and indigenous knowledge for food systems innovations. You as AGRA have been working a lot around this. We had the Food Systems Summit on the 23rd of September. What does this actually mean that we aggregate and we accelerate elements related to green jobs? It's already happening. Let's tell the story. Let's tell the Africa story. But let's also show this journey of how this is actually being done, and where the gaps lie and where the commitments can come through. And then lastly, but not the least, the point you raised, no one is safe until everyone is safe. I always say there is an intersection between climate and the COVID crisis. The fact that COVID is a zoonotic disease that's come out of sort of within our natural environment, there is no woman who's going to farm when they're sick. So let's talk about the vaccination inequity situation. There's no woman who's going to take care of her family and her community when she's unwell, let alone her family when her entire family gets sick and she's unvaccinated. So we have to also be cognizant of these issues. And a lot of these diseases are also being triggered by climate change. So the intersection is so very much evident on the African continent. We are in the middle of the tropics, and we're even more susceptible. Over to you.
So thank you so much, Dr. Mshanda. You do touch on something that's very close to my heart, which is really the data ecosystem, because I do believe that everything starts with a number. And if you cannot count it, you cannot do it. If you can't account for it, you cannot measure it. Therefore, we are lost as a lost species, women on the continent. What is the realistic solution? I mean, you from your institution, Leah, ourselves as AGRA, I always say it starts with us. What can we do ourselves for a start, and then have a collective majority to join us in solving, for one, the data evolution that you'd like to see? What ideas can you throw to us? And I can see some comments coming in the chat as well that I'll read out. But where do we start?
Two sides to the coin. Well, maybe more than just the sides to the coin, Aggie. First of all, institutions like yourself that generate the data, the eCrafts and others, et cetera, how do we also present this data in a way that is accessible, but also in a way that it's disaggregated? It's really showing the true picture of where the realities are. And then pair this data to what us, for instance, as the United Nations have to do with policies at the sort of political and multilateral level. So us as UNDP, for example, we go to a government and say, well, this policy doesn't quite work in relation to agriculture or versus, land, depending on how the country sort of pegs itself and its respective ministries. So that is one element. And then the other element is, I think what this pandemic has done for us is provide an opportunity around the importance of systems thinking. That systems thinking and systems leadership is so important. So a lot of times the data that is showing that, how do we connect the data of deforestation and the data of health? Because they're actually connected. So the health sector is collecting one set of data. These are the number of people that are sick. And Ministry of Agriculture is collecting another set of data, and Ministry of Forestry is collecting another set of data. And yet these data sets are all very interconnected. The fact that deforestation is taking place, the fact that we're seeing more floods in a specific locality, we will see emergence of specific disease, and we will see the connection to, if a crop failure happens, we will see more levels of malnutrition and challenges and stunted growth in children. But how do we make sure that these data sets are speaking to a system? And so that for me is an important element. And so even when we bring conversations like this, we need to realize that it's important to have interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary teams in terms of the work that we're doing. If we're talking about food systems, we have to bring in, those economists, we have to bring in those data scientists, we have to bring in those money people. As Leah was saying, we have to bring in all of those individuals. We have to bring in the indigenous leaders, the traditional leaders, because that traditional knowledge system, there is a way in which that data is also collected and complement some of the making process going forward. So even as different individuals who are working in these fields realize, climate change is the opportunity to bring together multi and interdisciplinary technical or non-technical teams to really forge along going forward to find a solution that is meaningful for your respective communities and for the collective going forward. Over.
Thank you. That looks like we've got so many miles to walk down that route, but I do like the proposal of a multidisciplinary and an interdisciplinary, a collective, basically, that we need to be able to focus on. And the beauty of that is really the technology is here with us. The data is available. It is probably speaks to what Diana Nanono in the chat is talking about, that we need the political will first. So back to you, Dr. Leah. As a young person, an entrepreneur, an activist, do you believe that we do need political will to get this conversation going? Share with us your experiences in terms of working with governments and the commitment they bring to this conversation.
Oh, yeah. I mean, government is obviously important. I actually just want to go back to your previous question because I'm very much on the data revolution train. I think it's so important.
You can come to that too, yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just think it's my call would just be to entrepreneurs to create value from it, because data in essence is the new commodity. There's just so much value in data. And for example, with genetic data, for example, there's companies that are now collecting genetic data in Africa because, the genetic diversity is so big. And the benefit of that is then Africans can start getting the right medical treatment, because that genetic information can then start feeding back into proper healthcare. And I think, that's a company that's driving it, as opposed to sort of just trying to find this data. And I think for companies to try and find and notice the value in data, you can really start driving businesses and actually getting really holistic data sets as well. So that's sort of my suggestion on that front. But yeah, back to sort of the government level, I think, it's a bit of a push and a pull. I think at some point when it comes to innovation, there's a very big open gap before anything is legislated and regulated, and governments obviously love finding resistance. And I think you have to almost just go ahead and ask no questions until it becomes so big that they can't ignore you. And then you start having those conversations and make that positive change, because the governments have a lot on their plate. They're not looking at everything. So I think as innovators and as scientists, we need to push the boundaries and not be put off by all the barriers that are seemingly in front of us, because that is how we're going to make the change. We're going to have to push them ourselves. We can't rely on the government to change it for us. We have to really start pushing ourselves and engaging, as we go along. But I think if we had to sit and wait, nothing would happen. So that's my approach anyway.
And it has worked. Look, you've set up 2 companies and going. So yes, no, I do like that. Is the second idea that comes through, I think. So one is, working around the interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary components to be able to get this data into one ecosystem. But 2, I hear you challenging entrepreneurs on the call. And I think for Value for Her, where we have business women on the call, the point is, with whichever data you have, how are you creating value out of that data? Did I hear you right, Leah? And I think that in itself is gold. As they say, data is the new gold. So we have it, however unstructured it is. As we wait for governments to get their house in order, there is an opportunity right there for us entrepreneurs, for us women leaders, to make sure that we use whatever data is there to create the next big solution for the continent. Coming back to you, Dr. Msonda, I would like you to share with us your experience as a woman, as a leader. How has it been getting to the top? Can you share with us your experience in being a woman leader and being in those meetings where you're solo or you're just a couple of you? We're quite familiar with that environment. What does it take? Because they say, if you can see her, you can be her. And I was delighted to have had you and Leah on the call, because if we can see you, we can be who you are and get other women to come and be us. What has it been like, and what does it take to get to break those glass ceilings?
Thank you so much for that question. But before I respond to that question, I just want to talk about the political willingness and the technology question. I just want to say, I mean, there's so many viewers on this call who are working in agriculture, obviously agriculture value chains, and exploring specific technological issues. Here's what we found in UNDP that was incredibly problematic. There's several countries on the African continent. So we're having a conversation on one side that's talking about, let's have drones, dropping very precision specific seeds and location, and great discussion. Then you go at the country level, and Dr. Leah wants to order a drone into Uganda, as an example. The drone policy of specific countries is actually within the military policy. So you cannot actually bring a drone into the country. So these non-enabling environments, even when you have a brilliant idea, the policy is not supporting that. So even as we talk about this technological advancement, we need to begin to really look at the lay of the land and what that actually means for women and for all these sort of amazing innovators out there on the African continent. And this is what we've been discussing as the UN. It needs to be an open book where you don't have to worry about having to enter, and which is also why the Africa Free Trade Agreement is also very critical in that aspect as well. Going to your question, it's been an exciting journey. I mean, what I can tell you is even my setting up of the network of African women environmentalists is I believe in one thing. Because I have dual heritage of being Xhosa from South Africa and Bemba from Zambia, both communities that believe in Ubuntu. I am because we are. And it is this that for me has taught me that even as I journey, as an African woman, I am not self-made. I am made by a collective of different elements and different individuals that have been a part of my journey. And so even in getting to this top, or whatever you may consider as the top, I mean, for me, it's been an exciting journey because I have so many women who've been part of my life who I reach out to and seek guidance. And even when I'm at my lowest ebb, I'm struggling with something, and something that I make reference to in a lot of writing that I've done called my She Village. It is this She Village that I tap into and say, look, I'm going to be going into this role where I am the only Black person sitting at this table. How do I respond to this? Because I mean, just this week, I've had a situation where there's been a racist dynamic that has come towards me. And I was like, really frazzled because I thought, oh, this person, we're in a good space and whatever. And so how do you react to that, with a firm, but also calm space? Because a lot of times, oh my God, she's an angry Black woman. So those are, these narratives that are thrown at us. And what I believe in very strongly is also the power of mentorship. whether you do it, you know, one-on-one, or you do it in person, or you do it in sort of in different way. You know, three sisters of mine and I, myself, Acheng Batla, and Micheline Intiru, who you may know, all working in different and divergent, we got together as three Black women and set up what we call We Three Queens of Africa to really talk about these challenging topics. Let's just talk about the issue of imposter syndrome. You know, many women are going through that. You're brilliant agriculture, agroecological scientists. You're just feeling so afraid to present your idea. Who pushes you forward? Who do you reach out to just handhold you and say, listen, girl, this is going to work, you know? I have an idea, somebody who can write a proposal for you and guide you. So how do we facilitate these conversations collectively together? It's absolutely very important. But also I believe in the power of going together. You know, there's a saying that says, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. I so believe in really bringing the collective with you. And I think this is where the power of Ubuntu, and this is where really as a collective as Africa, we do come, you know, we love to eat together. And I'm sure this COVID pandemic was tough for many people. We love to be a part of the community. We love to sort of think together, you know, reflect through these ideas together. And so for me, it's really bringing others along and not just saying, look, I just want to be the only person who shows up here. And also really realizing that there's always that voice of no. How do you reflect and have introspection on the voice of no? There's always somebody telling you, please, really? You think you're that good? Nah, come on. I mean, don't be over yourself. And yet, you know, we're trying to boost confidence in young girls and young men and young women. And so how do we make sure that they really begin to resist that voice of no? Because a lot of times, you know, I've been in instances where people ask me, sorry, which university did you go to? University of Zambia. Wow, you mean, is that even like a university? Yes, it is a university and it exists. And, you know, so people begin to be very condescending of your heritage and all of that. We need to be also proud of who we are, our heritage, our history. And I'm so glad that Leah is here to even talk about insects. When I've spoken in European settings about insects being part of our, you know, food systems, it's sort of like, ew, you know. And yet the European Union this year passed a whole regulation about using insects for food and feed. So that in itself is a beginning of a change that, you know, suddenly our cultures are being respected and recognized and the value of what we've known for a long time. And so for me, one, the power of the collective, listening and making sure that that voice of no does not deter you, going together, the power of Ubuntu, it is absolutely important that you bring others together. You just bring, you know, others along. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Musonda. I can see the audience is in awe of your presentation on the power of the Ubuntu, but sharing your experience and which really resonates. And it's amazing that you talked about the Ugandan experience, because in my previous role, when I was the MD of NTV in Uganda, I was the first to actually import a drone into the country. And on landing, it's been there now for 5 years, never been cleared. And I was told I needed to get clearance from the military. So it is a reality. Meanwhile, our neighbors in Rwanda were, you know, moving blood, you know, from one place to another using the same drones. So I guess the regulation policies that really work to solve for the opportunities are a reality. And we must be able to bring the evidence and to keep nudging our leaders to bring the right policy environment that will indeed build a whole market systems ecosystem that allows people to participate. But let me carry this forward to you, Dr. Leah, because George in the chat was talking about there is need for entrepreneurs to work closely with youth innovators. As a youth innovator, does this resonate with you? Was it a challenge at any one time, or are you taking an effort to actually work with other young people in their innovations? Can you share your experience with us? Over.
Yeah, before I answer that, I just really want to resonate with that voice of no. I think it's so true, and I think especially when you're a female leader in a space, sometimes, well, often females lead very differently, and I think usually we're quite empathetic, and I get a lot of backlash from some of my male colleagues because they think I'm too gentle, and then sometimes you question yourself. But I mean, I think often I've realized that you actually get sometimes a much better response from people because they actually notice that you've engaged with them on a different level. And so I think that voice of no does come into play a lot, especially when there is such a strong evidence of male leadership throughout the generations, that it's almost seen as a weakness sometimes when you lead as a woman. And so I can really relate to that. So that really resounded with me. So thanks. But yes, I think it's really important for entrepreneurs to engage with youth. You know, when you're starting a company, when I started a few years ago, it was really hard, and there's so many things you don't know, especially when you're a youth. I think you're very young and dumb, and you're brave, and you just go ahead and forge forward, and you think you know everything, and you just make so many mistakes, which is, you know, equally important. But I think there's a lot of mistakes that you don't need to make. And when you start, because then I started reaching out to other entrepreneurs, and I learned so many things from them, even with regards to things like fundraising and sort of how you approach it, and networking, and sometimes it's just even silly things. And I mean, I've also started engaging with a lot of young people as well. And whenever anyone reaches out to me, I make my utmost effort to try and engage with them as well, because, you know, I found it really difficult, especially as a scientist. Like, I'm not a business person, so to sort of try and merge science and business was like two foreign languages. I was like learning hieroglyphics or something at one point. And so I think it's really important to engage with entrepreneurs as youth, and also to to see your gaps in knowledge and identify it, and just reach out and try and look for that knowledge from people. And just reaching out, I mean, 90% of the time people are so much nicer and receptive than you think they're going to be, and I think you just need to take that chance, because, you know, we all start there as entrepreneurs, and you know what it's like. So I think it's very important for entrepreneurs to reach out to youth, and vice versa as well. It should be sort of a back and forth, because especially as you're starting a company, it's nice to sort of see the new up and coming companies and ideas and thoughts, and I think it can be quite a nice ecosystem, both, you know, for everyone, not just for youth, also just for, you know, entrepreneurs as they're going through their journey as well.
Thank you, Dr. Leah. I hope, George, your question has been answered, but I think the point is really agreeing that, yes, young people need to be mentored, and we probably need to have programs that allow them to learn faster rather than repeat the mistakes that many entrepreneurs have had. So, Dr. Leah, there's a follow-on question for you from Lily from Green Agriculture, and she's interested in knowing what type of insects are you looking at?
Cool, thanks, Lily. I've looked at a couple of different insects, but my main focus is on black soldier fly larvae. So it's not really a traditional insect that's eaten in Africa, or anywhere really. It's more of a farmed insect. But the reason for that is because it can be farmed sustainably. So there's also, you know, the concern with over harvesting and sort of creating that unbalance in the ecological landscape as well. So it's also important to look at finding ways to farm insects sustainably as well. So that's why I focused on the black soldier fly larvae.
Thank you. So Leah, one follow-on question again, specifically to that question, is that, so I think the conversation, since we're talking business here, and I think we've had quite a number of ideas come through with the black soldier fly. Is this business model scalable? And what are some of the constraints that you can flag for people in the pathway to build these business models?
Yeah, it's definitely scalable. There's different sectors for it. I think on the food side, it's maybe a little bit more challenging from a consumer perception standpoint. Even for consumers that are used to eating insects, they're not necessarily used to eating black soldier fly larvae. So I mean, there is a distinction. It's not just because you eat one thing, you eat the other thing. But from an animal feed perspective, it's really very scalable, and it's quite amazing because it can use agricultural waste. A lot of companies in South Africa are using spent grain as an example to feed the black soldier fly larvae. So you're reducing that waste element, which also means your feed input is a lot cheaper or non-existent depending on your partnerships. So it's definitely scalable. And I think especially in the warmer regions in Africa, where you don't have to have temperature control, even more so, then your energy costs are negligible. I mean, the technology is still emerging, but I think the opportunities are just immense, especially from a waste management point of view, which is, a huge challenge in a lot of African countries where they don't have proper waste management for agriculture.
Okay, thank you, Leah. I like the framing on your website that says you can eat sustainably and ethically and still be able to consume something that is nutritious and has the flavors of the African taste. So yeah, I am an advocate now for you. Great, so we're coming closer to the end, and I'll come back to you, Dr. Msonda, with probably 2 more questions. The first one from Sylvia Namara. She's quite a pessimist though. She says the discussions at COP26 continue to challenge her mind, and she feels that the commitments might not actually come. What is plan B and plan C for women in agriculture in sub-Saharan Africa? So she's asking for a plan B and a plan C. This must be an accountant.
No, thank you so much for that question, Sylvia. I mean, the bottom line is, let's face it, what COP26 is doing, that is a very multilateral process. So your respective governments are negotiating and discussing specific text going forward, etc. But you must also remember that there's a lot of conversations that are actually happening in the corridors of COP26. So for me is, this is also part of this process in the sense that there are discussions and conversations of different organizations, civil society groups, non-state actors, really having in-depth conversations, because let's face it, multilateral processes are very long and prolonged, very elongated, etc., and all of that. I just want to let you know that, time and tide waits for no man, and many people are continuing to do things, and women are continuing to do things in their respective communities, because the reality is they are facing the crisis now. Even as we're in COP discussing and talking, there's somebody there with the threat of a potential flood. There's someone there trying to figure out, oh my God, there hasn't been any rain. What are my options here? Who should I reach out to? What mechanisms, etc., within their communities? So there are activities that are actually happening. And I think this is where we need to flag the stories and the realities of that. We are doing something. We're not just sitting there twiddling our fingers and trying to wait for COP26, the leaders to return and fly back home and then tell us, okay, we've got 20 million. Even those billions that are being discussed there, it would take a while to just set those processes in motion. But here and now, I think there's a lot of actions that are taking place. And for me, it's also the power of the collective, the power of the story. Let's begin to tell the world that, yes, you know what, we're doing something, we're not twiddling our fingers, but here's where the gap lies. The gap lies in the sense that I cannot get this technology because really all I'm focusing on is trying to get the seed, and I don't have the resources to upskill, amplify, and to take this to a whole different level. I'm working with women X, Y, and Z, etc. And I think this is where the finance gap comes in, and to try and find the opportunities for funding. But ultimately, we need to say that, we're not just sitting there, watching our screens and somehow waiting for something to happen. There's a lot that's actually going on. And I think that's where the world is also waiting to see, because I think thanks to a lot of youth voices on the African continent, I mean, we can see the examples like Vanessa Nakate in Uganda. She was there calling out the challenges of the climate crisis, etc. But also she was raising monies, which she successfully did, to actually have solar panels on the school that she went to. She crowdfunded for that. So already finding a solution within her community to do something. The same thing, Oladasu Adenike from Nigeria in the Lake Chad Basin. The same thing with Elizabeth Watuti here from Kenya. They're doing something and going, whilst they're also really challenging and campaigning and calling for that shift in the pledges. Let's move the pledges action. And I think it's a great time to be a part of the African continent. Over.
Thank you very much, Dr. Msonda. Indeed, time waits for no woman. War and man, right? Correct. So I think I would like to challenge our audience in the chat to give us one idea that you will start doing from today. Because it's not enough for us to demand our governments to, come to the fore. It's not enough for the youth to be talking and raising their voices. What are you individually going to start doing differently to protect our planet? I would like to see some ideas in the chat. And as I do that, I'll be coming to you, Dr. Leah, to share with us what are the 2 things that have emerged out of COP26 that you are proud of, and what are the 2 things that you are not proud of so far?
Yeah, okay, sure. That's quite a tough one. I think what I'm most proud of about this COP is they've put in a lot of effort to bring non-state actors to the conversation. So you're getting a lot more companies, organizations, and universities becoming part of the conversation. So it's not just at a government level anymore. And I think that's really important because everything sort of needs to go hand in hand. The one element needs to implement it, but then the companies also need to implement it on a different level. So, for example, you can see with the different days that are siloed, like it's gender day or it's land use day, it makes it a lot easier for non-state actors to also start engaging. And I think that's been a really, really big and positive impact. And I think from an agricultural point of view, I think it's the first time that it's really had its own conversation. In land use day, there was a huge component of it that looked at agriculture, specifically at land restoration and how regenerative agriculture is a prominent part of that. And I think it's really important, arguably it's not as big as it should be a part of the conversation, but the fact of the matter is that it's starting and that it's there. And I think that's really, really important. I guess the 2 downsides is that, I think it could be more so. Agriculture is a huge emitter, and I think it needs to be spoken about a lot more. Food is something we can't live without. And so I think it needs to be a bigger part of the conversation. And I think the other thing is, we're still making incremental changes. For example, when they're speaking about clean energy or agriculture even, they're looking at livestock and they're just looking at one component, which is methane, and they're trying to find ways to reduce methane by changing feed, for example, whereas you could just look at changing the farming style completely to a more regenerative approach, and then you really look at the picture a bit more holistically as opposed to just one element or one key emitter. And so I think we need to start looking at it a bit more holistically and sort of as a systematic and sort of how everything interconnects, as opposed to just like, oh, this is the biggest emitter, that's what we're focusing on, because there's still lots of other components to it. I think we're still a little bit too focused on one or 2 things, but it is complicated. So, we'll get there. That's my hope.
Great, I see you're another optimist there. So I'll come to you, Dr. Msonda, as well. And maybe specifically to, since AGRA is in the, we're trying to push this whole sustainable farming approach, where we're looking at, intensive production to address the, the food gap, so the opportunity to feed more profitable businesses, but also keeping a healthy planet. What we have realized is that a smallholder farmer, let me use my mom, Kenyanji from Nyachenyi in Uganda, she will need more reason to start farming in a sustainable manner because the cost of farming increases. She will need to have more labor on her farm, within that same 1 acre. And yet she's got to feed her children on a daily. So there are some trade-offs. What incentives should we be looking at to ensure that this smallholder farmer in Nyachenyi, in whichever village we all come from, is actually knowing, learning, and adopting the practices that we need? Dr. Msonda.
You know what, Agi? I grew up in a rural part of Zambia where I spent my life, and it took me going to university in Lusaka to realize that actually, when we drove into Lusaka, I remember looking at my father and thinking, what is going on, and what is the situation with all this monoculture and agriculture? I saw maize as one situation. But what I remember from my situation with my grandmother was that it was an agroecological system. Maize was together with some corn and with some other, I just need to tell my children to excuse me. Guys, excuse me. Excuse me. Thank you. Okay, can you guys excuse me? Then we'll just talk just now. So in essence, basically the challenge of agroecology has been that a lot of local farmers, let's just look at what happened when the COVID pandemic happened. When the COVID pandemic happened, a lot of farmers, the value chain of just supplying those fertilizers was cut out. and people could not even remember where their traditional seeds are. So even as we begin to talk about food system, let's also talk about the issue of food, seed sovereignty and food sovereignty. So for a lot of indigenous and traditional peoples, they have used systems that have been incredibly sustainable, and it is possible to actually grow food that way. And in fact, it reduces, we know that if, systems are more agroecological and more biodiverse, there's even a lot less infestation, etc. And giving an example of Zambia, we're dependent, like many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, to grow maize. And we had a massive crisis with armyworms, wiped out. And then suddenly we were talking about, there's a crisis, there's starvation. I was like, I'm confused, because every time I go in my village, there is no starvation, because we're dependent on cassava, on millet, and sorghum, all of which are drought-resistant plants, right? So for me, it's about rethinking these systems and the knowledge that we've lost. So there's something that happened with the decolonizing, and also a conversation that we need to have. When I've shown people a seed that's been a part of my family for 40 years, and they look at this corn that is variegated and different colors, that is the corn of my childhood. It's not a whole cob of white corn. So we also need to rethink the sustainable systems and making sure that these systems are regenerative. And I think this has been part of the discussion of the UN Food Systems Summit. So we also need to learn from indigenous peoples and indigenous traditional systems, and also encourage them, because before, it's a lot of these farming systems that have encouraged a lot of monocultures that are very problematic and are not in any way supporting biodiversity.
Okay, I think that kind of tries to wrap up for us today. But before we wrap up, I will say that we should look at the comments in the chat. Our audience has been extremely engaged, sharing with us what they are going to be doing. And I just love the ideas that are coming through from Ethiopia, Nigeria, Zambia, Tanzania, Kenya, and the list keeps going on and on. So thank you, guys. Clearly, the commitment is live. The action is here. But before I close up, I'd like to hand over back to Sabdio to give us one sneak peek into Value for Her. But before I do that, let me thank the beautiful, intelligent, energetic Dr. Leah and Dr. Musonda for coming to join us for this Value for Her Talk Corner. It's been a real pleasure hosting you, and Aluta continua. Back to you, Sabdio.
Thank you so much. What a team, what a discussion. It's so wonderful to hear all these very, very interesting, statements, reflections, insights from these very powerful panelists. Thank you so, so much. And just to pick up on the Value for Her part, and I'm so glad, Dr. Musonda, that you made reference to NAWE, and I actually have noted that down, and I'm certainly going to reach out to you, Network of African Women and Environmentalists. We do have something that we call Value for Her, and this is a network of women in agribusiness in Africa. And at the moment, the network has about 2,000 women companies. But the idea is to help women to thrive also on the on the business end of agriculture. That is the idea. They are together on a digital platform. We call it the African Women's digital marketplace. That's what we call it. And of course, the brand name is Value for Her. And from the name, you can see it's really how do we increase value for women from agriculture. We know that they do provide labor, mostly on the production end of agriculture. We know that there are lots of limitations. You talked about them. There's land issues. There's land ownership issues. There's, of course, access to different productive resources that they need. But yeah, there are also more opportunities on the business end. So why should women not thrive there as well? So we are talking about getting them to high value markets. We're talking about trade, taking advantage of Africa Continental Free Trade Area protocol that has been signed. And and collectively, and I really like your Ubuntu, your Ubuntu frame. which is really collectively we can be something. And that is why we are building this platform that brings them all together. And I hear you, Leah. I hear the optimism for Africa's youth. And I really look forward to engaging also. And VALUE4HER has a special place for young females. And we really look forward to people like you that can drive the innovation, that can bring energy and drive into this big network of Africa women in agribusiness. So this is what I wanted to share. And I just to add to Aggie's, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a very, very interesting, exciting discussion. We will have a recording and we will share it also with you guys so that you can follow, you can tweet, you can share on your social media. And we will certainly reach out to you again soon to take some of these ideas forward, either through the networks that we are running or also through specific programs that we have. Thank you so much. And Aggie, do you want to say a last word? Or?
No, I wouldn't. But thank you so much to the panel and thank you to our audience online. It's been a real pleasure. Stay safe. Yeah.
Thank you.
And Ubuntu. And Ubuntu, Aunabari.
Ubuntu. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. And thanks to our participants here. Thank you. Bye.